Hi, and welcome to our webinar on Discrimination and the Equality Act, which we originally hosted on the 29th of June 2023. I'm Emma Fay. I'm Managing Director of the HR Department, Wilmslow. We help our clients who are small and medium-sized businesses in and around Wilmslow, Alderley Edge, Bramall, Cheadle, Cheadle-Hulme, and those kinds of areas. We help them with all their HR needs, and the HR department itself is a wider network. We cover the entire country pretty much. So if you do need any HR support for your business, please do get in touch and we'll be happy to help. The purposes of this webinar today are to discuss the topics of discrimination and the Equality Act, focusing on these topics within the workplace. And specifically, we're going to cover today the Equality Act itself and what this actually means for you as a people manager or a small business owner or an employer, or maybe you're all of those things. We're going to talk about the different forms of discrimination. There are a few different types and how these look in real life, and I'll give you some examples of those as well so that you can become more familiar with the different types of discrimination. And then we're going to talk about unconscious bias as well. And whilst it's not strictly discrimination, unconscious bias itself, it can lead to discrimination if it's left unchecked. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. Roughly 30 minutes of content, maybe a bit more, 30 to 40 minutes. So nothing too long, and hopefully you do find some really useful tips within this session. So the Equality Act 2010, that's when this legislation came into force, although it wasn't entirely new content, it was a new act. However, it actually pulled together various parts. Hi, and welcome to our webinar on the topic of discrimination and the Equality Act. We originally hosted this webinar on the 29th of June 2023. I'm your presenter for today, Emma Fay. I'm also Managing Director of the HR Department, Wilmslow. We help small and medium-sized businesses with all aspects of human resources, from recruitment through to performance management, people management, through to dismissals and everything in between. We work predominantly locally, so I work across the Wilmslow, Alderley Edge, Bramall, Cheadle, Cheadle-Hulme areas, but we are a national franchise, so the HR department covers most of the country. Today, we are going to cover the Equality Act itself and what this actually means for you as a people manager, a business owner, an employer, maybe you're all of those things. We're also going to talk about the different types of discrimination and give you some examples of those so that you can become more familiar with how discrimination can present itself in the workplace. And whilst it's not actually discrimination itself, we are going to cover the topic of unconscious bias. It's an interesting topic, and actually unconscious bias can lead to discrimination if those biases affect our actions. So I'm going to be looking at about 30 minutes, maybe 30 to 40 minutes worth of content today, and I do hope that you find it helpful. So to start off, the Equality Act came into force in October 2010, and whilst it was a new act, it wasn't necessarily brand new content. The aim of the Equality Act was actually to bring together the previous anti-discrimination laws, such as the Race Relations Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, just a couple that you may have heard of, but there was actually over 100 pieces of legislation brought in under the Equality Act. And the intention behind the Act is to legally protect people from discrimination, both in the workplace and in society in general. The purpose as well was to make the law easier to understand, and also in some circumstances, the protection that individuals have was strengthened under the Equality Act. And the Act sets out in detail the different ways in which it is unlawful to treat somebody. So in terms of discrimination, the key thing with discrimination, I mentioned there that it's in the workplace and in wider society. You don't need to be an employee to be protected under the Equality Act. This is why we always say the protection actually kicks in at the recruitment stage. So the very moment that your business starts recruiting, you need to be mindful about potential discrimination, and that comes through to your job advertising, the methods that you advertise, the process that you use to screen candidates, through to their employment when you hire that successful candidate as well. So it is a pre-day one protection for employees. And there are 9 protected characteristics defined by the Equality Act. There's religion and belief, and this incorporates philosophical beliefs, which we do see a lot in the media about these at the moment. We have seen cases such as a belief in ethical veganism being protected, belief in anti-fox hunting being a protected belief, but political beliefs aren't necessarily covered, and neither is support of a certain football club, as was found in a recent tribunal case in Scotland. Disability, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about disability in a few slides' time, because it is there's a specific definition of what disability is under the Equality Act, and this also a bit of a different obligation put onto an employer if an employee has a disability. Marriage and civil partnership also gives somebody protection against discrimination. Age, and that's any age, whether you're young, middle-aged, old, whatever that may be. Sex, race, gender reassignment, sexual orientation, and pregnancy and maternity. So those are our 9 protected characteristics. And at the moment, pregnancy and maternity is quite a key one, and we are looking to see the law change slightly in relation to that protected characteristic, in that protection is going to be wider, most likely from April next year, in relation to redundancy. The types of discrimination, whilst we've got our 9 protected characteristics, well, what does that actually mean? It's arguable we all have at least 1 or maybe 2 of those protected characteristics. Some people will, of course, have more, but we've all got an age, haven't we? So we could all be the subject of discrimination. But how do we know what that discrimination actually looks like in real life? Well, direct discrimination is, as the title would suggest, very direct, treating someone less favourably because of a protected characteristic that they possess, that they are assumed to possess, or that someone that they are associated with possesses. So the key things here are that the individual themselves does not have to have the protected characteristics. We might assume that they are older than they are, or we might assume their religious beliefs. But they may not have those protected characteristics. They may be younger than we thought they were. But if we've treated them less favourably, it's still discrimination. Similarly, it could be that someone that they are associated with has the protected characteristic, not they themselves. So in a workplace, it could be that our employee has a family member who is disabled or has a partner of a certain race. If we treat our employee less favourably because of that associated person, it will still be direct discrimination. So some examples of direct discrimination, it could be that an employer refuses to promote a female employee because she's pregnant. It could be that an employer decides not to hire a certain candidate because of their religious belief. It's very direct. It's very much linked directly between the conduct and the protected characteristic. It's quite clear to see the link. Then we have indirect discrimination. Now, indirect discrimination is perhaps less obvious to see and is potentially easier to take place by accident. And this is where a business applies a provision, criterion, or practice to a group. So we're applying this to a group equally and fairly on the face of it. But by doing so, we put people with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage, and we also fail to justify that. So the justification part there, the Equality Act says that discrimination can be justified if the person who's discriminating can show that it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And that's a bit of a legal phrase, but it basically means that we might be able to justify our provision, criterion, or practice, even if it is discriminatory. An example there could be the fire service, for example. So the fire service requires job applicants to take a number of physical tests. And it could be argued that those who are older may be less likely to pass those tests than younger applicants. So it could be indirect discrimination in that the practice of asking individuals to undergo these physical tests is putting older people at a disadvantage. But actually, the fire service can probably justify that because firefighting is a job which requires a high level of physical capability, isn't it? So that's what I'm talking about with regards to the justification. But in a lot of cases, indirect discrimination is not going to be able to be justified. Some other examples of indirect discrimination could be a retirement age. So it could be that whilst the retirement age itself was abolished when the Equality Act came into play, it could be that a business still has a retirement age of 65 or 67. And in doing so, we're effectively dismissing people over a certain age. And that's going to be a policy which is indirectly discriminatory against older people, unless there is a justification. It could be that we have dress codes that put more extreme requirements on one gender than the other. So we've seen dress codes called into question a few times over the years where female employees are perhaps expected to go to more extreme lengths with their appearance than male colleagues, and that could also be indirectly discriminatory. The third type I wanted to talk about is harassment. And harassment is unwanted conduct related to a protected characteristic or unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, or offensive environment. And if you look at that definition bit by bit, you'll see it is actually quite wide. Unwanted conduct, that means it's unwanted by the person receiving the conduct. And that's really what matters in a harassment situation. It's the person who's observing or the person who is feeling intimidated or feeling degraded or offended. It's whether they say the conduct is unwanted. The conduct is related to a protected characteristic, so it's related to sex or age or any of those other protected characteristics, or it is conduct of a sexual nature. And that could be jokes or banter, as we often hear it. It could be the sharing of inappropriate memes or images in the workplace. It could be comments of a sexual nature. It could be inappropriate staring. And it has the conduct has to have the purpose or effect. And I always underline the or effect bit. It doesn't have to be intentional. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Purpose or effect of creating that intimidating, hostile, degrading, or offensive environment. And you'll see there, if you think about that definition, how difficult this can be because harassment is, in a lot of cases, very subjective. People are offended by different things. People are intimidated by different things. And what one person deems harassment, another person might not. So the key thing is it's the person, like I keep saying, who's on the receiving end of the conduct. And the key thing as well is that, similar to what we talked about earlier, it doesn't have to be the victim themselves who's actually being harassed. They don't have to be the subject of the conduct. It could be that they're observing the conduct in the workplace. They're not actually the target or the direct recipient of the conduct, but it doesn't matter. They are seeing that conduct. It's creating that hostile environment for them or that offensive environment for them, and it's related to a protected characteristic. The key thing with harassment, really, in my opinion, is enabling a positive workplace culture where individuals can raise when they feel uncomfortable or offended, and there are robust processes to deal with those instances. People feel that they can raise it and they're not going to be told to just deal with it, or they're not going to be called boring because they didn't join in with the joke. It's taken seriously. There's open communication to raise awareness of what was inappropriate about the conduct, and individuals are educated enough within the workplace to understand what harassment actually is, and that it's not lawful. And we often see with harassment cases where we see grievances and potentially resulting in disciplinary issues, where the individual just says that they simply didn't know. They were just joking. It's just the way we are here, those kind of things. And unfortunately, it just isn't a defence to harassment. So people do really need to take responsibility for their conduct, and be very aware of their audience, not just those who they are directing the conduct at, but those who might be observing or hearing what they're doing. And employers do need to take all reasonable steps to protect their staff from harassment. So that does mean taking complaints seriously, investigating properly, even if you don't fully understand yourself why that complaint's been made, why this person is so offended. Do make sure that you're investigating it fully with an objective frame of mind, and actually putting a stop to the conduct if it's found to have happened. And again, making sure you've got that education side within the business. People are trained in this area, and that training is refreshed, not as a tick box exercise, but as a genuine learning exercise as well. So, victimisation, then, the last type of discrimination that I wanted to talk about today. Victimisation is when someone is treated less favourably as a result of being involved with a discrimination or harassment complaint. So it's quite specific, this type, and it's probably, in my experience, the type of discrimination that we come across the least, probably because it is such a specific link. Someone needs to have been involved with that complaint side of things first. But to give some indication as to what victimisation can look like, it could be things like labelling someone a troublemaker because they've made a complaint in the past. It could be leaving someone out of team events, isolating them from the team. It could be passing someone over for promotion because they've previously made that complaint or been involved with the complaint. Those types of behaviours and conduct is not going to be acceptable, and it will be considered victimisation. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk specifically about disability. Of the 9 protected characteristics, it's slightly different to the others. But what actually counts as a disability? Well, someone is disabled under the Equality Act 2010 if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities. And that's a key definition, and it is a legal definition, not a medical one, and that's a key point to make. And again, if we go through this definition bit by bit, it should make it easier to realise quite how wide it is. So physical or mental impairment, that's quite wide, isn't it? It's pretty much any impairment, any illness, but one that has a substantial, so that's anything more than trivial, substantial, and long-term. So when we say long-term in this definition, generally it means 12 months. An impairment that has lasted 12 months or is predicted to last 12 months. Long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities. So it doesn't have to have a negative effect on their ability to work necessarily. It's just on their normal daily activities, going about their normal daily business at home. So there's some examples on the screen here: diabetes, depression, and some other mental health conditions, arthritis, MS, back pain, if it's chronic, cancer. These are all likely to be considered disabilities. Now, the reason that I say that disability is different to the other 8 protected characteristics is that if someone does have a disability, or you reasonably are aware that they do. You, as their employer, must consider making reasonable adjustments at work to enable them to continue working. So if someone has gone off sick and they do have a disability or likely to have a disability, you need to go through that process of looking at, well, what could we change within reason to enable that person to come back to work and work productively and work well and stay in work. It's not a case that just because someone has a disability, they can't work, we need to dismiss them. That is again likely to be discriminatory if we haven't gone through that process of trying to make reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments are going to vary from business to business and role to role, and very much depending on what the health condition is that you're dealing with your staff member. It could be physical adjustments such as different equipment in the office, different chair, a parking space closer to the office door. It could be different working hours. It could be some more support, some more management support. It could be a whole range of things. If in doubt, when it comes to disability, I would suggest that you seek medical advice. That medical advice being via a referral for the employee to occupational health. There are external occupational health companies who provide that service, or by writing to the employee's GP. And both of those processes will need the individual's consent, but can be very helpful processes for understanding what the employee's health issues are and what reasonable adjustments might be helpful in those circumstances. So, having talked about discrimination then, I wanted to talk a little bit about unconscious bias because it's a really interesting topic. And whilst it is not discriminatory to have unconscious biases, we all have them, and we're not all discriminatory people. Unconscious bias can actually lead to discrimination if we do nothing about it, if we remain unaware of the biases that we have. Our brains are wired to automatically make quick judgments and assessments. I remember reading that it was something to do with evolution and survival back in the day, being able to quickly decide whether someone's a threat or whether someone's a friend, someone we can work with. And those judgments aren't necessarily helpful, they're not necessarily accurate, and they aren't all going to be positive either, unfortunately. Some might. We will often make positive assumptions about somebody very quickly, but we of course are going to make negative ones as well. Everybody does it. No one's a bad person because of having unconscious bias. We all do it. And I think that makes it easier to accept. I remember when I first started reading about this topic and understanding unconscious bias, and it's quite uncomfortable to accept that we're all judging people. We're all doing it. But once you accept that, that's when you can start taking steps to overcome the potential impacts. And the biases that we have are influenced by our own backgrounds, our own experiences, societal stereotypes, and also cultural context. There's loads of things that will have influenced what judgments we're making about people and what assumptions we're making. So we're all going to have different ones, slightly different ones. But when we leave unconscious bias unchecked and we let it influence our actual decisions, that's when discrimination can occur. So what I wanted to share with you on this webinar is some tips, some ideas about how we can overcome unconscious bias at key decision-making points as managers. So on the next slide, you'll see I've chosen 3 key decision-making areas as a small business owner, an employer, a manager, whichever one of those 3 things you are, if not all of them. Recruitment is a really key decision-making process, isn't it? Maybe more so in a small business because everybody is such a key person, aren't they, in a small team? And if unconscious bias is present, which it will be because we all have them, but if it's left unchecked, we're potentially going to recruit the wrong people. That might be that we recruit someone because we have really got on with them and we've made judgments that they're just like us, they're great, they're brilliant, and then we hire them. They haven't necessarily got the aptitude or the skills for the job. And therefore, unconscious bias has left us making a poor decision. At worst, we might have unconscious biases that are discriminatory. We might then make a recruitment decision that's discriminatory. We might turn a candidate down based on our judgments about them. And if we have no objective justification for that, in terms of we can't show why we made that hiring decision and that it was based on fair and objective criteria, we might end up at risk of a claim. Moving on to performance management, thinking about the day-to-day performance management, the one-to-ones, the reviews, pay reviews, appraisals, putting people on performance improvement plans, all that kind of thing. Again, if unconscious bias is left unchecked, we might end up making the wrong decisions. We might come down harder on certain individuals over others. We might spend more time having a really nice appraisal meeting with some and skip past others. People are then going to end up with very different experiences of management and potentially not getting the right level of support and management throughout their employment. And then on the redundancy side of things, again, if unconscious bias is present, we might end up choosing the wrong people for redundancy. We might actually go down a redundancy process that wasn't even there. There wasn't a redundancy situation at all. And that's where we need to be really careful. And so on the next slide, I've put some examples as to things that you can do to help overcome unconscious bias at these three decision-making points. So with recruitment, blind CVs are quite popular now. So having people's names, addresses, dates of birth, anything that identifies things about them that you don't really need to know as a recruiter, that can help because we can't judge something if we don't know it. Standardized and objective selection process, so making sure that when we are recruiting, everybody goes through that same process and that process is fair in the first place. And it's actually finding out what we need to know for the job and for the business. We're not finding out, again, unnecessary information that might skew how we see that person unnecessarily. Having multiple people in the process, and specifically in interviews, one person interviewing, it might be difficult to make an objective decision because, again, we do all have these unconscious biases and they will influence how you see people. So having another person in the interview, preferably someone different to yourself in terms of maybe their role, their position in the business, personality type and that kind of thing, can be quite helpful to get that extra perspective when deciding whether someone is suitable for a role. And in performance management, having clear job descriptions or role profiles, having key performance indicators and objectives written down, these things help us manage people against agreed criteria rather than doing it on a whim and doing it as to how we feel about that person at that time. And having consistency in how we manage people as well. So giving everyone the same opportunities for one-to-ones and appraisals and performance reviews. If we are putting someone on a performance improvement plan, making sure we're consistent with that as well. Would we have done the same with this other person? And making sure we've got an objective way to talk about that if it's challenged. So if someone was to say, well, why am I being put on this and they're not? Do you have a good answer for that? And that's where you really need to check yourself sometimes. With regards to redundancy, having a clear business case for redundancy right at the start of the process is key. So what is the actual reason that a redundancy situation has arisen? That helps us to show that it's not about individuals or any individual's views. It's about a business situation. And again, when selecting individuals for redundancy, we have objective selection criteria. We're measuring people on things that are objective, that are visible, and that can be challenged and backed up when challenged if we need to. So I hope that helps, and hopefully some of these things are really helpful in terms of just managing unconscious bias in the workplace rather than pretending that it doesn't exist. So back to discrimination in general, some tips as to how to prevent discrimination in your workplace. And the first one's key, it's training and awareness. If people don't know what discrimination is, it's unlikely they're going to avoid it from happening. Training and awareness, and we will suggest that you have policies around equality and diversity, policies that set out what actually is discrimination, what are those protected characteristics, what is the applicable law, examples of discrimination. Those are all really good things to have in a policy. Training as well could involve talking through that policy, asking questions about it, maybe e-learning during the induction process. We do offer e-learning courses on these kinds of topics. If you ever want to consider that, please do get in touch and we can talk through the courses that we have available. And actually full on-site training as well we can do for managers, and we do a lot of that now, where we go in and train a team of managers so that they understand what discrimination is and they can filter that down to their direct reports and be aware of when it happens and how to address it there and then as well. Having clear policies and procedures, particularly around those key decision-making moments. So we talked there about recruitment and performance management, making sure you've got those clear ways of doing things that are followed by all your managers and yourself consistently. Good management skills absolutely help to prevent discrimination. Managers who can call out behaviours that are not acceptable, who can lead by example, by not being discriminatory themselves, and who can actually impart that knowledge onto their team so that everybody becomes empowered to prevent discrimination themselves as well. Really key. A positive workplace culture, I mentioned that before, and this is a culture where people feel able to talk openly. They can say when they're feeling uncomfortable. They can raise issues with management and know that those are going to be acted upon, while still having nice relationships with people, while still having that nice jokey, jovial workplace atmosphere. When I talk about harassment earlier, I know it's very easy to then be frightened of even allowing any kind of banter in the workplace, and that's absolutely not what we suggest. One of our core values is having fun, and we suggest that fun is never taken out of the workplace, but making sure that everybody knows where the line is, and actually if the line is potentially crossed, there's no comeback if you raise that, and people take the feedback constructively, they learn from it, they apologise when they've done something wrong, and it doesn't happen again. That's all really positive culture stuff there. When there are new policies coming out on changes or new ways of working, do some consultation with the team, because when we talk about indirect discrimination, it often comes about because we haven't considered the impact of a policy on a particular group. And by consulting everybody before implementing the policy, you can catch those potential risks and address them ahead of putting the policy in place, and make sure that indirect discrimination is avoided wherever possible. Staff surveys can be a great way to do culture checks. So understanding at any given time, what do staff feel about working for your particular business? What do they feel about their colleagues? Do they feel as though it's a respectful workplace? Do they feel that they can raise issues and have them followed up on? All that kind of stuff. And as long as you do something with the survey data and you follow up where there's issues, surveys are a brilliant way to maintain that good positive culture. And what about when actual discrimination does arise within the business? If you have an employee who raises a concern that they feel they've been harassed, then you need to investigate fully. Even if you don't fully understand why the employee is upset at that time, you don't particularly think that what was said was offensive, it's not about that, as I talked about earlier, it's about how the individual feels. So make sure you investigate concerns fully, and if you feel that you can't be objective for any reason, don't be afraid of outsourcing that investigation or delegating it to another manager to make sure that there is a fair and thorough investigation carried out. Sometimes cases of discrimination can be dealt with informally. It might be a mistake. It might have been someone saying something that was just a bit over the line and they didn't realise. However, if we have serious cases of discrimination, we should be encouraging employees to use the grievance procedure so that that can be dealt with fully, and we might be using disciplinary procedures if if there is evidence of discrimination from any individual. And follow up as well. If there has been a concern raised by an employee, whether informally or formally, and we've dealt with it, please do follow up with that in a few weeks, a month's time, because sometimes we think it was resolved. We've said, right, going forward, this is what's going to happen, and then things slip back a few weeks down the line. So please do make a note to follow up on cases of discrimination to make sure it's definitely been dealt with, and that dealing with carries on as well. Now, I'm not going to ask for questions because this is a recorded session and there's nobody on here with me at the moment. On the live version, we do questions and answers, and I'm very happy for anybody who's watching this webinar to get in touch with me. As I mentioned, we are an outsourced HR company, so we can support employers with HR questions, whether it's about discrimination or any other topic. We have now recorded 5 webinars, including this one. So we have one on recruitment, we have discipline and grievance, absence management, performance management, and then this one on discrimination. They're all on our website, on our Knowledge Hub. So you can always have a look at those, have a watch. They were all recorded in 2023, so they're all nice and up to date. And I would love any feedback that you've got on these webinars as well. And if you think there's any topics you would like to see a future webinar on, please do contact me. My contact details are on the screen there, and we are on social media as well. Instagram isn't on that spreadsheet, on that PowerPoint sheet, but we are on Instagram. So please do connect with us, and if there's any HR advice or training that you would require for your business, get in touch and we'll see what we can do to help. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.